Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, Assistant Sports Editor for Multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined by Isaiah Maldonado, our Post-Gazette Penn State Nittany Lions insider for our weekly Penn State football podcast after a gutting defeat against the Indiana Hoosiers, number 2 in the country, on Saturday, and ahead of a game against Michigan State that they're actually somehow favored in by more than a touchdown, Isaiah, after everything that has happened over the last month and a half. We got a lot to get into there. Before we do, just want to remind you the show is brought to you by FanDuel. Isaiah, I think the thing that stood out to me from the Indiana loss was Penn State's response to it after the fact. Terry Smith and Ethan Grunkemeyer both went out of their way to dismiss the suggestion by some, including Tyler Donahue from Lions 247, a guy I like his work a lot. They almost called him out individually for his tweet in the middle of the week saying that he, during the team periods that the media observed, that the energy was low heading into the Indiana game. And after the game, Ethan Grunkemeyer and Terry Smith basically made the suggestion, we haven't given up, and look at this narrow loss to the number 2 team in the country. As evidence of that, they kind of were puffing out their chests and treating this as a moral victory. And Isaiah, I couldn't help come away from that thinking that it's kind of symbolic of and reveals the culture that James Franklin has cultivated. Look, I don't want to go in on Terry Smith. I don't want to go in on Ethan Grunkemeyer. They're dealing with a horrific situation here. Obviously, Ethan Grunkemeyer didn't expect to be playing these games, didn't expect to have 30 microphones in his face after these games. Terry Smith did not expect to be the interim coach. So I want to give them grace as individuals. That said, I can imagine James Franklin saying the exact same thing after one of these losses, as he has done for most of the last decade when they've fallen against some of these teams. And I think it kind of reveals some cultural rot there, and it kind of shows why James Franklin had to go, because there is a permission structure for what happened on Saturday. And we'll get into the talent level in a minute. I'll let you sound off on that, because it sounds like there's permission to lose those types of games from the very top.
For sure. And I'll play devil's advocate here, just because I do think there's a very different standard as to the situation that Terry Smith inherited and the situation that James Franklin cultivated these past couple of years. I think depending on the place that it comes from, I also too, I could hear James Franklin giving a very, very similar response that focuses on the fight of his players as opposed to the performance of the game and taking that stance. But I think that comes from a place of trying to take accountability without being direct, as opposed to Terry Smith, who I feel like this situation, as you said, truthfully is horrific. To go into the game on a 5-game losing streak is unprecedented to what we know from Penn State in the past decade or so. So I think they tried to make it seem like they weren't taking a moral victory. I mean, King Mack said it himself that, he spoke about it, and Amari Campbell spoke about it, that they're not trying to take a moral victory, that at the end of the day, they lost, they came up short, they understand that, and that things need to get better to move on. But this is objectively the best that they have looked, also, at least in my personal opinion, even win or loss, this is the best that Penn State has looked all season. I mean, because I'm not really going to sit there and give their defensive efforts against non-conference that much of a nod. I think the defense in this game, no matter what the reason was, between simplifying some play calling, adding in some more blitz packages, changing some minor things with the scheme to make it more like palatable to the players, this is the best that Penn State has looked, and it wasn't expected to look this good. You gave them a fighting chance. I didn't. I know a lot of other people also didn't. They went into the game as 14.5-point underdogs. And I went into this game thinking, I honestly don't even see them covering that. I think Indiana is going to win by more. And a lot of people, including myself, counted them out before the game even started. And that was not the team that I saw when I played. And I think that in itself, because of the mode that this program is in right now, and this rebuilding, trying to solidify some sort of semblance of what Penn State was is what we still can be and what we still are. I think it comes from a different place. So I don't like to hear it, because at the end of the day, you want to hear direct accountability. You want to hear from a coach what exactly went wrong. What are they going to do to make it better? You want to see them reflect on the game in a way that's going to directly contribute to winning next week. And I think while some of that was done, I do think it was kind of an emphasis on look at what this team did in a loss, which has a bad undertone. But I think it came from a very different place because of the current situation of Penn State. So I'm not going to be as super critical, as harsh as you might be, but I understand where it's coming from.
The thing I can't get past, Isaiah, is that this was a 3-star all-star team. That's what I've been calling them pejoratively on social media. Fernando Mendoza is a 3-star. Every guy on that team is a 3-star. There's a bunch of future accountants. And give credit to Curt Cignetti for having put this team together and made them as competitive as they are. But on paper, Penn State was the more talented team. That's why going into the week, for the last 2 weeks, I said Penn State has better players than this team. Penn State should beat this team in any other circumstance. If James Franklin was still here, if a few bounces go different ways in a couple different games, Penn State's favored. The 15.5 points, I always tell people that, the sports books set the line based on what they think they can make money on. And putting the line that high probably drew in a lot of, money against Penn State just because that is the way the sentiment is going. So my priors, I guess what I'm saying is don't shift just based on how the season is unfolded. And I guess I just have never been as impressed by Indiana as a lot of other people were because they just didn't have the talent level. And that's how things played out. And I guess that's why I see a little bit of tone deafness in the response, because you're not talking about hanging with Ohio State. You're not talking about hanging with Georgia or even Notre Dame, the team you lost to in the CFP last season. That's not who you were playing. You were playing Indiana, a team that you have more talent than on paper. When we went into the season 2 months ago, it wasn't even we weren't talking about this game. We said Penn State's schedule isn't strong enough because Indiana wasn't even a factor in that conversation. And again, you got to give credit to Indiana for what they've done, but that doesn't change the fact that Penn State has a more talented roster, and I think should have won that game. And therefore, I don't take the number 2 in the country ranking and say, wow, congratulations for hanging in there with them. This was supposed to be the most talented Penn State roster of the last 3 decades. Sorry, you don't get extra points from me for that. So I'm curious how your view of Indiana factors into that.
I mean, I think in terms of how I view talent is also a little bit of I don't know. I don't really hold too much weight on former high school rankings. And I think the term 3-star all-star, while definitely it's an indicator of the talent that they were able to bring in, obviously, because when a lot of those guys came to Indiana was not the school that it's playing up to be right now. So baseline talent level, I definitely understand the sentiment of Penn State has historically been great these past 10 years, have been able to draw in top recruits. That talent level coming out of high school and those raw attributes of physicality, speed, whatever, these guys are able to do, they looked better when they were, playing not as good competition in high school. But at the end of the day, I value a lot of production in what you're able to do in college. And regardless of whatever your ranking was in high school, I think it's hard to look at the production of both teams this year and say that Penn State is confidently the more talented roster, because I mean, even in the past, and once again, I think scheming also plays a lot into this. I think if you talk about like what team has more NFL prospects, like you're definitely going to sit there and say to Penn State, you have AJ Harris, you have Dani Dennis-Sutton, you have Zane Durant, you have these guys that were projected for the season to go very high, and that is an accumulation of their individual talents, absolutely. But I do think at the end of the day, we've seen a lot of guys take significant jumps, and honestly, I think Indiana wasn't completely healthy, and I don't like to play the health card, but not having Elijah Surratt was big for that offense. That is a missing player who going into the game led their team in touchdown receptions with 10. Now him and Omar Cooper are tied. Obviously, Becker came in and had a phenomenal game, was able to substitute and fill the void, but I wouldn't even want to imagine what Indiana's passing attack would have looked like had they had all 3 of those guys in there. And once again, not saying to play the hypothetical card because you play who's in front of you, but the game could have looked different. So I think this Indiana team is definitely better than what you might be giving them credit. I think once again, in the win against Oregon, they looked very, very solid. I think this is a team that this loss or this narrow win for them doesn't necessarily shy me away from thinking they have a shot at winning everything. They're not going to be my favorite. They never were. But I do think that we spoke about this. Penn State is undeniably a top 25 most talented roster in college football. Like, that's not really a debate when you look at players from top to bottom. And then even looking at receivers who unfortunately haven't produced much this year, but with the situations they come, I mean, we saw Treybor Pena do what he did for Penn State that last game with 99 yards, and he looked exactly like who he was in Syracuse. We've seen Devontae Ross have great games and be exactly what he was when he was with Troy. So these individual baseline talents of these guys can be great, but I do think that at the end of the day, the cohesion as a team and at the end of the day, production on the season has to factor into play. And I think Indiana definitely had a lead in a lot of those amounts. Now, I think Penn State made it a game because they kind of played like how they should have played the entire season, both on offense and defense. So I don't think this loss for Penn State makes me think that I'm as low on them as I should be. I think they actually do have a chance to at least win 2 of these 3 games, maybe potentially win out if they play like that. And it doesn't really lower me on Indiana too much either.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'd be crushing them quite as much if you don't come out and puff your chest out and say, the moral victory stuff. And, I do take the point that guys change over the course of their college careers versus high school. But my opinion of Penn State's roster was based on the fact that they returned so much talent from a team that set a school record for wins. And that was production they've done, in college. So I hold them to a higher standard for that as well. And, past this precedent, I think you've fallen short of that. And I couldn't help escape. Like, you'd never hear Ohio State players talk like this.
Yeah. Because
their fan base would devour them for doing it. And I think that's the difference between the programs at the moment is that, they got a hearty round of the same people who James Franklin had to stand on the field for 20 minutes before walking off before he got fired. The same people clapped for how Penn State performed in that game. And it's just, to me, the expectations are just so different for the two programs, even though Penn State fans want to fancy themselves as Ohio State when it's James Franklin being the guy doing these things. But you fall short against Indiana, now suddenly it's okay. I have a problem with that philosophically if you fancy yourself an Ohio State, a Michigan, a national championship contender. But I think I've said my piece on that. So let's get into the forward-looking stuff. Isaiah, Penn State's a 7.5-point favorite this week, according to our friends at FanDuel. So some optimism from the book there. I guess Michigan State's no better off than Penn State in a lot of ways as a program. So it'll be interesting to see how that game plays out. If we take them at their word, Isaiah, and they're still motivated, does a bowl game have to be the expectation for this group the rest of the way? Michigan State, Rutgers, I think those are teams that you should beat based on how you played the other day. I think Nebraska is kind of that pivot game of could go either way. Nebraska has had a better season for sure, but they are famous for melting down in similar ways to Penn State, even more spectacularly over the last handful of years if you take out this season. So when you look at the 3 teams in front of them, what do you expect from this group?
I think the only expectation for this group should be if you are serious about being able to go through the motion and say that this is a team that has maintained its composure, this is a team that their drive, their passion has not dissipated, everybody's still 100% bought in, then I think by proxy, even if you're not going to come out and say that a bowl game is what we need or is what we're fighting for, it should be the byproduct of what you're fighting for. Because obviously the end goal is to go 3-0, and then they went out on these last 3 games. They will be bowl eligible. And I think that at least gives you some semblance of at least a selling point for Penn State in the future. I mean, it's already going to be hard to pitch Penn State given the season that they had, given the uncertainty of a lot of players that are returning, still the uncertainty with coaching and what that's going to look like. You need to at least end on a high note to be able to say that what that season was, it was an anomaly. It was a culmination of losing Drew Adler and James Franklin firing and not understanding a defensive scheme of Knowles, like the poor offensive scheming by Kotelnicki. It has to be just, this was a once in a lifetime collapse because everything that could have went wrong went wrong. And I think being able to make it to a bowl game, win a bowl game, despite the season that they have, would at least give some people some faith that maybe that's the truth. Maybe this is a team that can get back to at least being a 9, maybe 10 win team. And that's being completely optimistic, given the turnover that they're going to have and just the way that things have unfolded. But that should be their mindset, that they want to make people buy into what Penn State was and think that they can still get that at the school. Then they need to win now. They need to make a bowl game. They need to win said bowl game. And how Penn State played on the defensive end with understanding the scheme, that's how they have to play moving forward. How just kind of fluid the passing game looked with Ethan Grunkemeyer being able to connect. He had 5 yards, go for 20+ yards or so. That's the kind of fluidity and the passing attack that they need to be able to see. They need to be able to see execution on both sides of the ball on ways that they have never seen before this season, even when Drew Aller was at the helm. So I think that undoubtedly makes it to where a bowl game has to be their end goal.
Isaiah, I wanted to ask you about James Franklin and Virginia Tech. There seems to be some smoke there in terms of him moving to the Hokies program. I find it interesting considering that they just finished fire best time at Penn State. What do you think of James Franklin being connected to that program? Could it pose some issues for the Nittany Lions on the recruiting trail, going up against the guy who has been running this program? Do you worry that if he moves relatively close, that he could import a lot of the Penn State program to Blacksburg and tell a lot of these guys who love him, who were very frustrated by him getting fired, are a lot of them going to follow him there, as opposed to if he went to like an Arkansas, or if he ended on the West Coast somewhere, maybe goes down to Florida, far away from where his base of talent has been?
I don't think that Virginia Tech is a school that's going to do that. I think it has to be a combination of both coach and program. And I think that's probably one of the lower tier programs that he could go to that I think that would really draw everybody away. And once again, I think it's hard to look at it because a lot of the main guys on Penn State's roster are not coming back. There's no questioning where Singleton's going to go. Kaytron, Durant, Dani, these guys are all headed for the league. So it's going to be a lot of those younger guys who either haven't played and a lot of that depth, or a lot of the younger guys like Kobe Howard or Chaz Coleman or Darius Dixon that do have a very bright future that could potentially make the switch. But I don't think that if you commit to a school like Penn State and the expectation that you had for Penn State, which was to be able to go to a school where you could compete for a national championship and play some of the highest level football, I don't think that you just turn around and go to Virginia Tech just because the coach that recruited you went there. I think it's a solid program. I think it's definitely a good enough school that it'll attract some guys from Penn State. But I think the main guys that Penn State is worried about keeping need to be more concerned about turnover to other top, Big Ten schools, or turnover to other top 10 schools to begin with. I think they've seen a lot from people like Darius Dixon, like Kobe Howard. Chaz Coleman had a couple of really good games in non-conference play. Obviously, the injury and has made him a little bit less present, and him being a predominantly pass rusher. That's why they sat him against Iowa, because he wasn't as effective against the run. These are all guys who still have some growth to do, but they are highly touted prospects. Obviously, when it came to Chaz Coleman, that was somebody who was neck and neck with Ohio State. I don't see a guy like that or a guy like Kobe Howard leaving with what they've been able to show and what the expectation was for them as players and what they want to accomplish going to Virginia Tech. It might draw some, but I don't think it's going to make too big of a difference for Penn State. I could be wrong. If, James Franklin is a player's coach, it's undoubtable from the way that everything went down that you could tell that he had the respect and love of pretty much everybody in that locker room. I think it depends on how much you value that. But if, football is a priority, I don't think that everybody's going to turn and jump ship to Virginia Tech of all teams.
See, I think that's the generation gap between us talking, because when I was 14, 15 years old, that was the heyday of Michael Vick, the old Big East, some of those huge matchups that those were my formative years. And I remember those as a college football fan and me being probably 10, 15 years ahead of you. I still look at Virginia Tech as a program that was a powerhouse, was a national championship caliber program. And then, they just didn't nail the dismount from the Frank Beamer era. I think there was, some common threads actually between the programs. Of Penn State had Joe Paterno, Virginia Tech had Frank Beamer. Penn State goes through the scandal, but hires the right guys in Bill O'Brien and James Franklin to lead you out of that era and set you up, for a more prosperous future. Went the opposite way at Virginia Tech, but I do think there is enough of a talent base around DC and Baltimore in that, Delmarva area, that if James Franklin can tap it the way he did at Penn State, or even a fraction of the way he did at Penn State, I think he could be a problem. Now, could he be a problem for Penn State? I think that's more of a question. That's where I tend to agree with you. If there's a guy if it's a head-to-head battle between Virginia Tech and Penn State, I think Penn State's going to win most of those compared to Virginia Tech until James Franklin does enough, if he goes there, to prove otherwise. But,
sure,
and you don't play them. And I think that's the big difference. They're not in the Big Ten. And we haven't seen Maryland in a similar spot, ever really challenge Penn State meaningfully, except for those sanction years. So I think you could argue it both ways. But, that's the one program he could go to that be like, I'd be like, oh, that could be a problem if a few things go right for him, because I think that program has higher upside than an Arkansas. Some of these other programs that are in that lower, he's not going to get the Florida job. He's not going to get the LSU job. Yeah. Some of those other lower tier jobs, most of them I don't think could mess with Penn State. I think Virginia Tech is the one that you're like, I'd be interested to see how that plays out. So we'll keep an eye on that situation. Isaiah, I wanted to ask you about Mike Elko. That stuff continues to simmer. He's from New Jersey. He went to Penn, so he's not unfamiliar with this area of the country, even though he's coached all over. He has some level of ties here. I'm sure if he was hired, you'd hear a lot of the same stuff that you did about James Franklin at the very beginning, even though he's from New Jersey, but you get that vibe. How seriously do you take him as a candidate for Penn State the further we go into this season with Texas A&M not having given him a contract extension? Because I think a lot of people have argued Texas A&M has the money to keep him. Mm-hmm. They'll give him whatever he wants to stay, whatever Penn State offers, they'll top it. And I believe that if Texas A&M really wants to keep this guy, they will, but they haven't yet. They have not been aggressive like Indiana was with Curt Cignetti, giving him an extension. So how do you interpret how this Mike Elko situation is playing out?
I think it's really hard to get a gauge on the situation, at least for me. I think obviously Texas A&M has overachieved this year, seeing them being able to the wins against Missouri. I think everything kind of points towards, with how successful the season has gone, why not go all in on keeping him? But obviously they haven't. So I think it's hard. I think obviously to be able to get a guy like Elko who has, been able to stand tall in the face of adversity, take down some really solid teams, be one of the few teams that are still undefeated on the season, I think it definitely draws a lot of attention to the move in itself. But I think at the end of the day, how serious do I think? I feel like this is probably more on the side of negotiations between the two of them than I feel like them letting him go. And I feel like that those are things that we're not really going to be able to see unless we have conclusive, solid reports or concrete reports, as opposed to just a lot of this. I mean, when it comes to talks of coaching, a lot of it is speculation, but it's hard to believe that they would be willing to part with him without much of a fight. And I don't think that you want him to go to not a team that you necessarily ever really have to play, but a team in itself that poses a threat in the grand scheme of things. Because once again, with the alumni network that Penn State has and its history, it's a school that in the right situation could bounce back very, very quickly. And I think his success as a coach, and especially this year, what he's been able to do with the Aggies, that's something where I don't think they would ever want that to happen. And I think they will be a little bit more aggressive down the stretch than we might think.
Yeah, I think part of the problem for Texas A&M might be the history, and you can say that they've got more money than God down there, and you'd be right. But if you go down the list here, I've got the index pulled up. Other than 2020, they've lost 3-4 games or more every season except for 2012 with Johnny Manziel, and 2010. So a couple. What you had Mike Sherman that first in 2010, then you get Kevin Sumlin in there, but there's just not it has not been the caliber of program of Penn State in recent vintage. And if money breaks the tie, great, but I think Mike Elko would look at Penn State and say, I have a better chance to win there than I do at Texas A&M, historically speaking, even with all the money they have. And maybe he makes a different calculation in terms of it's NIL now. That's what's going to run the show. That's why Texas A&M, to this point in the season, has shaken off some of those demons. But I think it'll be an interesting decision. I think the lure is still there with Penn State for a coach of a certain vintage. If Brian Hartline was offered both jobs, which one do I think he would take? I think it's a different conversation, though. For some of these guys, he's a little bit older. Penn State's Penn State. And regardless of the other factors, I don't think it's an open and shut case. It seems to me like he might be trying to keep his options open as long as he can, unless Texas A&M truly makes an offer he can't refuse. So we'll continue to monitor that situation. Isaiah, I'll get you out of here on this. Basketball team's off to a 3-0 start. I haven't had a chance to watch them because they ain't on TV. They're on Big Ten Network Plus, whatever it is. I ain't paying for that. So tell me what you've been seeing from the Hoops team.
They look solid. Honestly, that's really all that I can say as of right now. I don't hold – listen, I think non-conference play in basketball it's not something that I look at too hard. I think if you flash back to last year, they played great in non-conference play. Obviously, Big Ten plays where they really took that dive downhill. I think if you look at the level of people that they're playing, I mean, they smashed New Haven. Fairfield and Navy gave them some close matches. But in terms of overall, what I'm saying, at the end of the day, the win is what matters. And I think this specifically, with the way this team is constructed, this is a team that is only going to get better with time because it is led by freshmen pretty much, like wholeheartedly. If you look at statistical leaders, Caden Mingo leads his team in points, rebounds, and assists. It is spearheaded by Mingo being the highest recruiting program in history. Tunka has looked very solid. Stewart in his sophomore year has definitely taken a big jump from last year. And I mean, I suppose it's one of those things where he didn't really have much opportunity last year. So whatever the case may be, he's playing solid. I think the one bit of, veteran leadership that you have in Reed, he, in only, I believe, 21 minutes of play, 2.3 steals a game. They need somebody after the departure of Baldwin to be able to lock down the perimeter. Definitely bigger than Baldwin too. So at least able to contend in that regard. And I think it's a solid team. I think they could be a little bit weak in the front court. I do like Ivan Juric. So I think with that, it's a matter of seeing how he continues to develop. I think being 7 foot and averaging 1.7 rebounds a game is abysmal. This is a team that needs to play bigger up top. It is a very guard-heavy, small ball rotation as of now. But I think as currently constructed, like I said, they're young. The fact that they're able to piece a team this inexperienced and be able to go 3-0 in any regard to me is impressive. So, and I give a lot of credit to Mike Rhodes for that and what he's been able to do. I gave credit for him to still being able to have a very, very good recruiting class, despite the season that Penn State men's basketball had last year. And to be off to a 3-0 start with, people who are just getting their first taste of college ball, I think any sort of win in this capacity is a good one for Penn State.
Yeah, I think Thanksgiving time will be interesting because you get into some of these, quicker turnaround, higher focus games because people are sitting around for the holidays. That always seems to be an early litmus test for me. Is I expect you to win these games against these, outgunned teams the first couple of weeks of the season, but then you get into Thanksgiving and you start to play games that I think are nice litmus tests for where you are. So we'll keep an eye on the Nittany Lions and Mike Rhodes there. Isaiah, thank you for your perspective this week. thank you for putting up with my surliness, and we will plan to talk to you all again next week. If you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Help us out in the YouTube algorithm, and check out our written work at post-gazette.com.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.